Plato's going to talk to us about morality. Now he has a very real conception of what morality is. It's not, again, like I said before, his idea of morality is closely linked to what exists or what's real. He's following Socrates pretty closely here. Remember, Socrates linked up morality with the definition of what a human being is. Plato does a similar thing, although he explains it a little bit differently. So both Socrates and Plato are rejecting the sophistic arguments, or the arguments of the Sophists. We'll take a look at those as well. So, one important feature to keep in mind, though, is that Plato relies heavily upon a conception of the soul. Now, again, I know we talked a little bit about how Plato talks about the soul being this separately existing thing, and it's separate from the body. You actually need not buy into that picture so much in order to understand his conception of morality based upon the conception of the soul. So leave aside all that. Leave aside conception of the soul as a ghost in the machine sort of thing. Really, for the soul, started out as this notion of that which moves or animates the body. And in that way, yeah, there's plenty. You can talk about plenty of bodies as not having souls in that sense. They're called dead people. Now, dead people have bodies, but they don't have. But the soul is gone. The bodies don't move. If bodies move simply in and of themselves, then even the dead would move. And sorry, there are no walking dead or zombies. Even if there were walking dead or zombies, they would still technically have a soul because they're up and moving around. So this idea of the soul need not necessarily talk about this ghost in the machine sort of thing. It's just that which animates the body. And Plato thinks it has three parts. Now, before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the sophist arguments. So, before we really get into a lot of Plato's arguments about, or conceptions about the soul and how morality is going to be based upon the function of the soul, let's take a look at the Sophists' arguments. So remember, the Sophists were real big on the idea that either morality is relative or it's just a great fantastic fiction that we thought of to begin with. Well, they have four main claims. The first is that morality is it's simply what the culture says it is. What's moral just depends upon what your society and the history has said what is moral. And the only authority or applicability that a moral rule has is within that culture or society. And the second, they make the claim that if people were just acting on their own, if they're never observed, if they could get away with it, then they would always be immoral. People would never obey the moral rules if they could get away with it. Third, and we saw this with Thrasymachus, he thought that might makes right. And again, he's appealing to a lot of these ideas about what's moral being relative to the culture. And finally, what the Sophists say is that pleasure is what's moral. Seeking out pleasure and seeking out just goods of the body, we might say, is what is moral. There's really nothing else. Right? We talk about this honesty stuff, but it's okay to lie if it brings you pleasure. Well, there's some really significant problems with the Sophist approach. And you already think so. For the first one, that what is moral just depends upon the culture, then that means that every single cultural reform is immoral. There was a time where our culture said that your value as a person within the society, and according to the law, depended upon the color of your skin. And Martin Luther King did a lot to combat that idea. Well, if what is moral just is what the culture says, then he was doing something wrong. And that's silly. Of course he was doing something right. Of course we're equal, regardless of our skin color. So that's one big problem with that view. Let's drift on over to might makes right. If might makes right is true, then all those years that America had slavery through force was moral. Right? The government, the landowners at the time used force to enslave a whole group of people. Well, if might makes right is true, then what they were doing is moral. And hence, one of the motivations behind the Civil War was misguided. Well, that's just simply not true. It's immoral to own slaves. It's immoral to own another human being and treat them in whatever way you want through force. Let's look at the idea that if people could get away with it, they would be immoral all the time. Well, let's just assume that's true. What's that supposed to prove? Does that prove that morality doesn't exist? No. All it shows is that people are hypocrites. That's frankly not a big surprise. We do immoral things all the time, whether we're observed or not. That doesn't mean morality doesn't exist. It just means that we're not very good at being moral. You can think of the same thing with reason. People use bad arguments all the time. They even make a profession of it. It's called marketing, advertising. All right, there's an entire industry that relies on your bad calculations about probability. It's called Las Vegas. That doesn't mean logic doesn't exist. It just means people are irrational. Again, not a huge surprise. So even if it's true, it doesn't prove there's no such thing as morality. It just proves that we're not very good at being moral. Well, here's another way to look at it too. Why think it's true? I mean, it's not a conceptual claim. That simply doesn't follow from the concept of person that we're always going to do something wrong, especially if we're not observed. So what kind of claim is it? Well, it had to be an empirical claim. It had to be a claim made through observation. Now, practically speaking, we can't make these observations. For one thing, it's illegal in our society to observe people when they want to be unobserved. It's called an invasion of privacy, and it's not moral. It's not legal. Moreover, it's just simply impossible to observe every single human being, or even really, I'd say, a sample large enough to figure out that people always do the wrong thing when they're unobserved. Not to mention the fact that there are plenty of counterexamples. People doing the right thing when whether they think they're going to be observed or not. Right? Some of the reality TV shows are based upon this idea. So the sophist arguments about morality really aren't that good. They're just, they're just not well thought out at all. The final claim, though, about morality just being pleasure, well, that's a competing moral theory. And by the way, if morality is what brings pleasure, then it's false that what culture dictates is moral, and it's false that might makes right. Because quite frankly, our culture is not very good at dictating what should be pleasurable. There's lots of things that our culture dictates that aren't pleasurable. Same thing with might. It's distinctly unpleasant to be forced to do something. So really, only the last claim stands any chance of being any kind of moral claim. And there are several ethicists today that still endorse some version of that. They're usually called utilitarians. So the first three of the claims just don't work. Culture does not dictate what's moral, neither does force. And that people are immoral doesn't prove there isn't any morality. Well, Plato is going to have something to say about pleasure being what's moral. And again, it's going to rely upon his ideas about the soul. Now, Plato has a conception of the soul. And again, even though Plato does, you don't necessarily need to think of the soul as this ghost in the machine. It's something distinct from the body. Right? There's plenty of bodies without souls. They're dead people. But it need not be a ghost. So when we're thinking about the soul, Plato tells us that the soul has three parts. There's reason, there's appetite, and then there's spirit. Now, spirit actually might be the most familiar to you. Spirit is the drive, it's the move, it's the motivation. There are plenty of times when you lack spirit. That's when your alarm clock goes off and you have to make it to my early morning class. That's a lack of spirit. There's plenty of times where spirit drives you, even to excess. Right? So there are times when you are so motivated to do something that you forget everything else. And you even exhaust yourself. Right? That would be kind of an excess of spirit. Now there's appetite. And we're all familiar with appetite. Right? Appetite is, again, kind of like the bodily desires. Satisfaction of pleasure might be one way to start thinking of appetite. Now, it's not to mean that all appetite is bad. No, I mean, a lot of appetite is really good. You, as part of your bodily appetites, you need to actually eat and move and exercise. And these satisfy bodily needs as well. But there could definitely be excesses. Smoking, for example, is done purely much just for the pleasure. There really aren't any health benefits for smoking. Eating potato chips, or as I like to call them, non-nutritive flavor wafers. These things taste really good, but there's nothing more to them. That's pretty much the only reason why you eat potato chips, is because they taste good. And finally, there's reason. Now, reason is what knows. Right? Without reason, I wouldn't be, I personally can't tell you about these plants here, but through the exercise of reason, through observation and inference, and through knowing what things are, we can tell what these plants are going to do under certain situations. And we can tell, how to guide their growth and whatnot. There could definitely be an excess of reason, knowing facts just for the sake of knowing facts. We call that trivia. There's definitely a deficit of reasons. We desire not to know anything at all. Reason not only knows about these things, but reason, it's thought, will also tell us what's going to be valuable. So, science will tell us the different causes and effects regarding a body. You sit on the couch and eat potato chips all day, the effects will be, an increased heart pressure, an increased plaque in the heart, excess weight, actually with low amounts of energy. Science can tell us that exercise and eating a certain combination of foods, mostly heavy on vegetables and non-fat proteins, that sort of thing, will produce bodies that have lower fat amounts and have higher energy and lower blood pressure. Now, reason tells us what happens with cause and effect. Now, it's an additional function to determine which effect is the valuable one. So we have three parts of the soul for Plato. We have reason, we have appetite, and we have spirit. For memory mention image of reason, I think of a big raisin, or maybe even think of a raisin that looks like a brain. Right? Raisin for reason. For appetite, the easiest thing that comes to my mind is somebody with a grumbling stomach, and the stomach is growling, it's hungry, it has an appetite. Or you might think of an appetizer at dinner, whatever you like. For spirit, I think the easiest one, even though it's not a ghost, one way to think about spirit is a ghost. A memory mentioned image for spirit could be a ghost. So Plato's going to say that what's moral depends upon how these parts interact with each other, and that's going to be determined by their function. We'll take a look at each one as we go.